Kendrick. Um, one of you go to group one of you go to group two. It doesn't matter which one. I'm sorry, group two in the back corner and group three over here. That's it. Your group will get you caught up on what we're doing. Join group one up here at the front. They'll get you they'll get you caught up with what's going on. Nope, nope. They have all your supplies that you need up here. Up here at the front. So give that back to those guys. Yep. There you go. Sorry. Think back to the beginning in chapter one. Uh, the first paper written about the omnivore's dilemma, what did it deal with? What species of animal did it deal with? Rats, yeah, yeah. So rats and mice would be what? Omnivores. So yeah, they probably do eat acorns. How are you guys doing? You're just shaking your head no. What questions do you have?
My next question is who's eating the acorns here?
Okay. So Okay, so keep in mind that you don't know everything yet. So that's part of it. So the trick is understanding this thing as fully as you can. So this is about ticks. So we have two figures here. One is ticks per meter squared, so ticks per a certain amount of forest, and one is ticks per mice, per mouse. So the number of ticks on individual mice. So what's going on in the control grids? Well, no. So in terms of what when they talk about control versus experimental grids, what do they do? Okay, so in the control grids, they haven't added acorns. So the only thing you know about here is acorn addition. So they may have done other things in those grids as well, but you know that they've added acorns here. So when they added acorns, what happened to ticks per meter squared? Okay, so ticks per meter squared went up. What happened to ticks per mouse, per individual mouse? It went up a little bit in one grid, but it's not really, those aren't different actually if you average out across all of those. So you saw no change in the number of ticks per mouse, but you saw a big change in the number of ticks per meter squared. So what does that mean is happening? Hmm? So number of ticks per mouse didn't change, but total number of ticks did change. So what has changed? Who's reproduction? Not the ticks. Yeah, so let me think about it. Let me see if I can get an analogy going for you. If you have a company and the payroll is $50,000 per individual, and so your annual budget is $500,000 for payroll, how many employees do you have? You have 10. Great. I have business majors in the crowd today. So you have 10 employees. Um, if next year you're still paying each employee $50,000, but your uh, payroll has dropped to $250,000, how many employees do you have? You have half the number. So here, each employee is getting paid the same amount. Every mouse has the same number of ticks on it. But in one year, you have a lot of ticks in the environment, and in the other year, you have very few ticks in the environment. What's leading to that decrease in the total number of ticks? Think of it as what's leading to the difference in your total payroll. Yeah, you have fewer mice. So you have fewer mice in the control grids than you do in the experimental grids. And the way that you know that you have fewer mice is because the number of ticks per mouse hasn't changed, but the number total has changed. They went up here, so there must be fewer mice here, more mice there. So you give an acorn, you supplement the environment with acorns, that leads to more mice, that leads then to more ticks, not because each mouse is infested more, they're all infested at the same rate, but they're just more mice running around the forest. So now you have the beginnings of your food web. You have some relationships between who's eating what. How you guys doing? Tell me about your figure. Okay, so in some other figure, there's probably information about mice, and so you have control grids And in the control grids, they didn't remove mice, and in the experimental grids, they did remove mice.
That's why I'm so confused on the first one. It says before.
Okay, so it might be useful for you to know this is before removal, this is after removal, and after removal. So these are three different, well, two different
So
time
it's talking
periods.
about just removal for experimental grids then.
Yes,
Okay.
they left the control grids alone.
Okay.
Right?
So what are these grids? These indicate.
So that just tells you how many these are gypsy moth larvae, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this tells you how many gypsy moth larvae there are per tree. This tells you how many pupae there are down at the base of the tree, and then this tells you how many eggs are produced the following year. So actually, there are three different time periods. Um, A is before mouse removal. B is the number of pupae after they've gone through their larval development, and C is the number of egg masses. Um, you don't know this yet. It's the following year. Because what happens is they go through their development. They start off as eggs, then they become larvae, then they pupate, they overwinter as pupae, and then they emerge the following spring. So these are three different time periods: before removal, after removal, and then the following spring. So based on those figures, in the places where they removed mice, what happened to the gypsy moth, the gypsy moth? Both larvae, pupae, and egg masses, which would be indicative of how many adults are around.
There's a much higher mass.
Yeah, and when they didn't remove the mice, what happened?
Most of them just were nice.
So why didn't it affect the larvae?
Probably because the mice get nothing from them.
Okay, where do larvae occur in the forest?
Like,
What are caterpillar larvae feeding on? Leaves, good. And leaves are located, yeah, not at the base of the trees, but high up in the trees. Where are mice hanging out? Yeah, they're on the ground. Now, when the larvae are ready to pupate, what do they do? Hmm? Whenever they transition from a larval form to a pupal form. Pupal form is this inactive form when they form a cocoon. And in this case, these guys form cocoons down in the ground. So where did they get the pupae from? Can I borrow your thing? So density of gypsy moth life stages on or under burlap bands on trees. So they put burlap bands around the tree, and as the larvae and stuff are moving up and down the tree, they get to those bands and they crawl under them because it's nice and moist underneath there. So after the larvae have eaten all that they want of the leaves, they climb down the tree, they go to the ground, and then they pupate. They go into a cocoon form, and then they emerge from the cocoon the next year and then fly out in the forest, mate with other gypsy moths, and then lay eggs. So the larvae are up in the tree, the pupae are where?
On the ground?
Down on the ground. Where are the mice?
On the ground.
On the ground. If the mice are on the ground, what are they probably doing? And they're eating the pupae, which means that the next year you have fewer what to lay eggs? You have fewer adult moths to lay eggs. So now you know that mice are eating gypsy moth pupae, and that has an effect on the adults. And because it has an effect on the adults, it also has an effect on how many gypsy moths are around the next year. And so you get that from comparing places where they removed mice versus places where they didn't remove mice. All right. I've given you guys the most time because you have the most complicated of the three figures. Tell me about your figure.
So I think they're trying to show is that, initially in, what was it, 95, the experimental group, their population gets removed, but they get removed at the time the gypsy moth population is taking off, so that helps them catch back up to the control group. And of course, you get the winter extermination, the population falls, but the experimental group is given more acorns, so they survive the winter better. And of course, we see that in 1995 related more population. They concluded that mouse densities are associated with masting in the autumn when fruits and nuts gets produced, and mouse densities decline during winter because it is.
Yeah, so a masting event is when oak trees, all the oak trees in a forest will produce tons of acorns, and they spend a lot of their energy producing acorns in that year, and then they have very little energy for acorns the following year. And this is a cyclic kind of event. Okay, everybody, pick a number between, each individual pick a number between, that's a pretty good job. That's a complicated figure, and seldom does a group get all of the intricacies of everything that's in that figure, and you guys covered everything, so that's good.
What kind of genius?
Okay, all right, good. Everybody pick a number and write it down on your figure. Oh, sorry, a number between 1 and 100. Between 1 and 100, write it down. Sorry. Yeah, 1 to infinity, that's a lot. Let's do 1 to 100. Everybody have a number written down? 23. The person in your group closest to 23, did somebody get it exactly? Okay. The person closest in your group is the person who's moving. So a person from group 1, move to group 2, carry your figure and enough figures for the member of group 2. Somebody from group 2, move to group 3. Somebody from group 3, move to group 1. Cameron. He's got it. Introduce yourselves if you don't know one another, and then it doesn't matter which order you go to, the group can teach the new person, and then the new person can teach the group, or vice versa. Leave him with a figure, though. Because of the nature of your figure, it might be more productive for you guys to teach him your figure than vice versa. Because when you teach him your figure, it's going to make certain things in his figure clearer to him than they currently are. It will. It'll make more sense. Your figure will now make more sense because you see their figure. So he needs a copy of your guys' figure. Oh, did Cameron? Yeah, Cameron, give me. Oh yeah. Okay, cool. Did you take all of them? Yeah, you only need to take as many as your group needs. Yeah.
I just handed him everything.
Yeah, that's fine. So leave these over here.
But so the white circles are the control group, dark circles are the experiment group. So at the beginning of April, May of 1995, when the trees are all dropping, maximum one population of like acorns and other natural species in the population. So it's starting to go up as it naturally would in some months. And the experiment group is reduced in numbers. So they're going to take a whole bunch experiment group receives these gypsy moths. These gypsy moths, so the population is able to rebound as it has the sufficient source of nutrients. And then over the winter months, so mice should typically be fine. You can see that with the foliage with those white dots down there. It's going down as a mice population naturally would at that time of year. But these little black arrows in November and December.
So these ones,
And we definitely covered that.
and there's difference in the control grid and experimental grid. I think the experimental one, right?
So what did they do in the experimental to the mice?
I think they removed an acid.
They removed the mice from the experimental and they just did nothing to the control. Yep.
So, okay, so that like makes sense. So they don't touch the control, so the mice. So I guess that's what number below. But then the experimental ones are removed. So the numbers is there. This is don't forget this. But I guess these are supposed to go together though.
Yeah, so once you have these two figures, you can ask yourself, okay, does one figure inform the other figure in terms of what's going on? So now you know that they're manipulating two things. They're manipulating acorns and they're also manipulating mouse densities. Are they doing these things at the same time? Does it tell you when exactly they're doing these things in the figures?
Yeah, so those are, no, the eggs are laid
Sorry.
in, but this is the next year.
Okay,
This is, yeah, this is the next year. And since the pupae got egg, not as many moths are born, not as much moths and lay as many eggs. Okay. The next year. Got it.
Yeah, so how does the timeline of that figure tie into his timeline that's in this figure?
Yeah. When do
We see more of the white bars in the future instead of the past. I see it here.
Oh, so there's more variability, but that's not as important as where the averages are in terms of number of mice.
So the beginning is when both groups are in the like larva stage, which on our timeline is when we have the highest amount of time.
Yeah, so you have these. What do the black bar and the open bar mean? No, the black bar and the white bar at the bottom.
The black is the experimental, and the white is the control.
Yep, it tells you in the caption.
the Wi-Fi mice and then the gypsy moth?
No, the black is when they remove the mice, and the white is when the gypsy moths are pupating. So they removed mice slightly before pupation began, and then pupation occurred. So it tells you this right here. Yeah, it's in that one. So the white and black bar, the black bar is when they removed the mice, and when they removed the mice, you saw on the experimental grid, the number of mice went down because they were removing them, of course. But that corresponds to when the gypsy moths are pupating. And so those gypsy moths that are pupating, what's not happening to them on the experimental grids? You're all over there by yourself. Can you hear? Well, get over here so you can hear better. So if you're a gypsy moth in a grid where they remove mice, what happens to you when it's time for you to pupate?
You survive.
Yeah, you survive because there aren't as many mice eating you. And so that's the reason that they removed mice at that time period, is because that's when the gypsy moths are pupating. Then later on, what did they do? In the winter, they added what at these arrows? No. They added they added acorns, which is why on the experimental grids, what happens to mouse populations in the following spring? They're higher than they would be if you didn't add acorns to them, because not only are mice eating pupae, but they're also feeding on acorns as well. Such that when you get to the following spring, when gypsy moths are laying eggs, on the control grids, there are fewer egg masses because there were fewer pupae, even though you started off with similar levels of larvae the year before, because on the control grids, what's happening to all those pupae? They're being eaten, so there aren't adults to emerge the following year. There aren't egg masses. What's happening to the pupae on the experimental grids where they remove the mice? They're surviving, so there are more pupae. As a result, there are more eggs the next year because there are more adults, because those pupae survived. So this figure helps you with the timeline of what's going on in the figure that you guys started off with. All right, you guys feel like you guys have yours? Does it make more sense now?
Yeah, I feel like I got a better understanding.
Okay, good. All right. Keep the same numbers that you had before. So you still have your number written down on your thing. Two people are going to, so we're going to move from group to group again. If you moved before, you won't move this time. But this time, the person with the number closest to the number that I put on the board is going to move. The person in your group who has the second closest number is going to be the one who does the teaching of whatever the new person doesn't know. Does that make sense? Okay. 87. Closest to 87 moves. In this case, what? Nope, stay where you are. All right, listen. Listen, focus. Moving person. Take enough copies of your group's figure for yourself and the people that you're moving to. So group 1 is going to group 3. Group 3 is going to group 2, and group 2 is going to group 1. So move, and then we'll do who's talking. It's weird. This is always the most complicated part of this process. You guys get the figures down, but then moving from group to group always messes people up. You're moving here. Do you have enough copies of your figure? Take copies of your figure. So take Julie's spot. All right. Now that you're here, of the group who remained, whoever has the second closest number is going to be the one who presents whatever the new person hasn't been exposed to.
I am to explain it right because I'm second closest.
So you haven't been exposed to the figure 3, right? You've been exposed to figure 1 and 2. So who's the spokesperson here? Is it
I'm
Aiden?
second closest.
Okay, all right. So you have to explain figure 3 to him because he's already had figure 1 explained to him by Cameron.
Okay.
And he needs to teach you figure 2 because none of you have seen figure 2. You've only seen figure 1 and figure 3.
Okay.
Control group is like open circles and experimental ones on the flat circles. And after the
I'm glad we decided to find like acorns near the bottom of the dog mice, and the mice are being fed on by the chicks. So that's what we can. Not as complicated
It could be much more complicated, but in this case it's not. That's one of the nice things about this particular study is it's a relatively simple food web.
I talked to the kids out there already.
Hmm?
I'm on for that night. We already talked to the kids about this one.
Yeah, but so which figure have you not been exposed to? Where'd you come from? You came from over there. Oh yeah, yeah. So you haven't seen figure 1, and they hadn't seen figure 2 yet. No, wait. They hadn't seen figure 3 yet. Yeah. And so who's doing the teaching here?
I think I am.
Okay, so you need to know about figure 1. Do you have a copy of figure 1? I'll get you a copy. Need a copy of figure 1? Figure 1, figure 1? Give me a copy of figure 1. Sorry. There you go.
population starts to go up.
You've already explained. It's your job. Whoever the second closest, which I picked a number far from 23, so it wouldn't be the same person. All right, so you guys got it together? Show me your food web.
Oh, God.
Aha, so you don't have it together. Put together a food web that you guys can all agree on. And then this paper is actually not about mice and acorns. It's actually about something else that doesn't appear in any of these figures. Think about why. So this is published in a really prestigious journal, Science, which is like the top journal for science in the United States. Why would this study have been published in that journal? It has to be about something bigger than just mice and acorns and ticks. What might it be about? That's of more interest to human beings.
And then the second graph is when they're coming down onto the ground.
Mm-hmm. They come down the tree and pupate in the soil.
And their population is going down because they're being eaten, or because that population goes down just in that time?
They're being eaten by the mice, or the mice are also.
Okay, so it's like when the mice are in the trees, they have choices with leaves.
The mice don't, I don't think they really go.
Mice don't climb trees. They're ground mice.
That's not that sound.
It would be odd. I mean, I've seen rats up in trees in the tropics, but these are temperate mice. Oh, there's nothing worse than doing a frog survey, and then there's a rat coming at your face down a liana, and you're out in the dark at night by yourself with just a bunch of feral rats. Yeah, no, it's not good. It's really not good. You're just trying to get your work done, and you think you're going to get your face eaten off by a rat.
And then the third chart is just showing that because more of the moths survived in the experiment group, their population the next year is going to be higher than the other.
Yep, these pupae will emerge as adults, and it's the adults that lay eggs.
Okay, so this is not the next generation. This is the adults of this generation.
Well, this is the eggs that make the next generation, so the
Okay.
adults from this generation are producing these eggs.
Okay.
Yep. Once you have all that figured out, draw your food web, how you think the food web is operating. You guys have a food web for me?
I just, I'm just trying to figure out how, because like every food web that I saw.
Mm-hmm. It's showing, what you have is you have arrows that show the direction of energy flow.
Okay.
So energy is going from what to what in this particular food web. What species to what species. All right, you guys working on the structure of a food web? So draw a diagram that represents the flow of energy from one species to another species in this system.
It's like thinking the math is big, but how the food web works, it's not like linear, like, because the moth doesn't eat things, right?
Moths do not eat ticks.
All together the food web.
Yep. So take all the information that you now have and say, okay, how does this food web operate? What's at the base of the food web providing the energy that drives the whole system, and then who partakes of that energy, and so how does energy move from one species to another species in this system? You can build up. I typically build up because I think of plants being down on the ground, but that's just my preference.
So that's what bottom we have acorns and moths. There's mice. Feed off the toad.
So it doesn't have to be linear. It can be more like a web. So generally, we put plants at the bottom, and then herbivores, then carnivores, working our way up, but that's just convention. Doesn't have to be that way. And once again, it doesn't have to be linear. You can have a particular kind of plant that is fed on by multiple herbivores, etc. So moths are getting eaten by mice. Mice are getting eaten by ticks. What do the moths eat? They eat the leaves of the tree, don't they? And what else are the mice eating? They're also eating acorns. So you have to think of the tree as providing two sources of resources: the leaves of the tree and then the acorns of the tree. Also think about how these things might feed back on things. If a moth is feeding on the leaves of the tree, what does that do to the tree's ability to do photosynthesis? Yeah, it can't because it doesn't have leaves. So the next year, what's going to happen to its acorn production? It's probably going to go down. So the moths actually feed back on the trees in terms of a feedback loop. When the moths are abundant, they're eating the leaves, which makes it harder for the plants to produce acorns the following year. How might that inability to produce acorns influence the moths of the following year? Yeah, sure, except that you don't have a feedback back to the tree, and you don't have a connection between trees and acorns.
Okay.
As you're working on your food web diagram, as you're thinking about your food web structure, think about the fact that you may have feedback loops. So when the moths are eating, what are they eating? They're eating the leaves of the tree. If the leaves of the tree are being eaten, what does that do to that tree's ability to do photosynthesis? It decreases. If it has less energy, it has less energy to put into what? Making acorns, which then might influence the number of mice, that then might influence the number of ticks, and might also influence the number of moths. So think about feedback loops as well. We call it a food web rather than a food chain because There are these web-like interactions that occur. As you also think about this, I want you to think about the fact that this appeared in the journal Science. So the journal Science is a very prestigious journal, and you have to ask yourself, why on earth would this paper have appeared in Science? Because who gives a damn about acorns and mice and ticks and gypsy moths? Gypsy moths are devastating in the Northeast. They killed a bunch of trees back in the late 1800s. So people who do lumber companies care about gypsy moths, but they're about the only ones who really care all that much about gypsy moths. So ask yourself, what might this food web influence beyond just ticks and mice and gypsy moths that people might care enough that would land this paper in the journal Science rather than just in some forestry journal somewhere. So there's something else that's not in any of these figures that this paper is really about that is due to this food web, that is influenced by this food web. Continue talking. Do you guys figure it out? If you did, don't say it very loud so the other groups can't hear.
You said something about
Population density, food and shelter,
No, it has to do something that people would care about. People I'm going to tell you as an ecologist, people don't give a rat's ass about mice and acorns. People do care about ticks, though. If you've ever been out in the field and you got ticks. Because then it's going to affect something that matters to humans. Well, yeah, sure. But what specifically might humans be worried about? Especially in the northeastern United States. These are little ground inhabiting mice. They're tiny. People wouldn't even know about them for the most part. So gypsy moths do kill trees. They can be quite devastating. You can go on the web and look for gypsy moth damage, and they'll strip trees completely bare of their leaves. But that would mainly be of interest to foresters, people who are involved in growing trees for lumber and stuff like that. It's not going to be societally important. Why do people care about ticks? What disease? Lyme disease. Go back and think about the food web that you've drawn and ask yourself, after a masting, what might you expect to happen with something like Lyme disease?
can they transmit to mice?
Well, once again, we don't care about mice, we care about humans.
Well, I'm saying like the transmit to mice get in your house and stuff. I don't know.
Nope. You would get Lyme disease from a tick. So think about the structure of your food web and ask, what does this food web tell you about patterns of rise and fall of the incidence of Lyme disease in human populations? What'd you guys come up with?
So the question was what would mess up the food web, right?
Nope.
Okay.
The question is, why would we care about this particular food web?
Okay.
Why would we as humans care about this particular food web?
Like what you just said, like some of like the lumber company, because like.
Yeah, but that's a really small subset of the human population. And if that was the answer, I wouldn't have given it to you. Come on, Cameron, you know me.
I guess also, I guess people like rodents.
Less having to do with rodents. And speak softly because I can tell that group over there is trying to listen in on us. I see what you guys are doing. Oh, gee, okay. All right, I'll come and check on you in a minute. Of these species that are in this food web, which is the one that you would think about most if you were out walking around in a forest? Why? So they can latch onto you and suck your blood, but what else do they do, potentially? Yes. Like what?
Lyme disease.
Yes. So look at your food web and ask yourself, what can you predict? Can you use this food web to predict when people are going to be more or less likely to get Lyme disease walking around forests in the northeastern United States? How does this food web inform an epidemiologist to be able to predict maybe a year or two in advance of when Lyme disease is going to have big Lyme disease outbreaks among humans? Do it. What'd you guys figure out? And did you figure it out by going and looking up the paper, or did you come up with it on your own? Okay. What'd you figure out?
We think probably the main hypothesis is that they're trying to look at the number of ticks in terms of Lyme disease for humans, and also because mice get eaten by other predators, mice getting or ticks getting transferred to whatever is eating mice might be important.
This paper is all about Lyme disease.
What?
It's all about Lyme disease.
That was Jake.
So in what way does this food web help epidemiologists, for example, think about Lyme disease?
More ticks, more Lyme.
More ticks, more Lyme disease, but you know that there's going to be more Lyme disease how far in advance?
Based on the level of moths and mice and acorns.
Yeah, so you might be able to predict a Lyme disease outbreak a year in advance of when it actually occurs. And if you're an epidemiologist, what you can do is, based on what's happening with oak trees, when you get a masting event, it's a masting event that generally occurs regionally. All the oak trees in a region will produce this pulse of acorns. That pulse of acorns leads to a increase in mouse populations, but not until the following year, because the acorns are produced in the fall. So if you see a masting event in the fall, you can put out recommendations to people that for the coming summer, take more care when you're out in the forest, because you should expect to see an increase in the incidence of Lyme disease. So you can actually get some predictive value out of just knowing what's happening with oak trees to figure out what's going to be happening with the human disease that is common enough, but cycles. It fluctuates over time in terms of how many people contract Lyme disease in a given year. Good. All right. So when you think about this food web, all of you figured out that this food web is really about Lyme disease. And so when you think about the oak trees, you have to think about the oak trees in kind of two parts. Oak trees have leaves. Who eats the leaves? The moths. The moths eat the larvae. But the trees also produce acorns. Who eats the acorns? Mice. What else do mice eat? They also eat the moths. Who feeds on the mice? Ticks feed on the mice. What kind of ticks are these? Oh, I did put mice over mice, didn't I? What kind of ticks are these? Larval ticks, but what species of ticks? Does it tell you? I forget if it tells you in the figures. Where's the tick figure? Oh, it doesn't tell you. Actually, these are deer ticks. So what else feeds on acorns? Squirrels, sure. Snakes do not. What was that? Somebody said? Deer. Deer also feed on acorns. And what feeds on deer? Us, but who else? Ticks as well. They didn't show data in any figures about deer, but they also had data about deer. So when you have a masting event, A masting event leads to an increase in acorns, which can lead to an increase in mice. When you have an increase in mice, what does that do to moths? You see a decrease in moths, but what does that do to the tick population? It's an increase in ticks. And ultimately, that means that next year you're going to have an increase in the incidence of Lyme disease among humans. If you have a decrease in moths, what does that do for the leaves of the tree? Yeah, they're better off, which means that they're more likely to produce more acorns the next year, which means they'll produce more mice, which suppresses moths but leads to more ticks. But generally, after a masting event, what usually happens? Because the trees have put all their energy into producing all these acorns, what happens the following year? Somebody said something. Yeah, they would decrease. So after a masting event, you get fewer acorns, which leads to fewer mice, which leads to fewer ticks, but it leads to more moths, and that has what effect on the trees in terms of leaves? Fewer leaves lead to fewer acorns, fewer mice, more moths, fewer ticks. So these masting events involve huge expenditures of energy. Such that the trees don't mast year after year after year after year. And so what will happen is you'll get a year of masting. That leads to high survival of mice over the winter, which leads to a lot of mice the next summer. And so if an epidemiologist observes a masting event, they can put out health alerts for the coming summer to basically tell people to be more cautious about ticks while they're out in the forest. But because that masting event uses up so much energy, they generally don't mast multiple years in a row. And so as soon as that first masting event happens, you enter this feedback loop where you have fewer leaves, well, you have fewer acorns, which means you have fewer mice, which means you have more gypsy moths, which means you have fewer leaves with less energy for producing acorns. And so you enter this kind of negative feedback loop. And you may stay in that negative feedback loop for years until environmental conditions change such that all of a sudden the trees have stored up enough energy, it's a good year for growing, and then you get this masting event. Then that masting event for a year leads to a big production of mice, a big production of ticks, but that generally only lasts for a year because, once again, the trees have expended a huge amount of energy on this masting event. So food webs are just these descriptions of how energy flows through ecosystems. Ultimately, of course, all of the energy for this is coming from the sun through photosynthesis, but that's what's driving everything. And all of these species are releasing energy in form of respiration. So they're using up that energy that is fixed by plants in photosynthesis to power their own metabolism. And so this gets us back into thinking about photosynthesis and thinking about the carbon cycle, in that we take the glucose that's being stored up by these trees and we're burning that glucose up through this food web and releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So that's how a food web is tied to a carbon cycle, but they're slightly different because one's talking about energy, the other one is talking about an atom. Questions about that? All right, Friday we will start talking again about history of the 20th century as it applies to agriculture and vice versa. Those of you who weren't here in class on last time, I have your exams. Keep them. Yeah, I don't need them. Kendrick, I've got your paper. Miles. Bradley. Mark. Kendrick. JT. Not here. Oh, there you are. Thought you had left already. Still haven't seen you.